She called me Mom for 31 years. I need you to remember that before I tell you what happened next. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in early November, the kind of morning where the light comes through the window at a low angle and turns everything golden. I had my coffee, 2 sugars, a little cream, and I was reading the newspaper the way I have read the newspaper every single morning since 1987. Not on a phone, not on a tablet. A real newspaper, folded in half, set flat on the table next to my cup. My husband Gerald started that habit with me. When he passed, I kept it. Some things you keep, not because they are practical, but because they are proof that your life had shape. I was 64 years old. I owned my home in Savannah, Georgia, free and clear. I had retired from 26 years of teaching 3rd grade at Pinewood Elementary, and I had a pension that covered my bills with enough left over that I did not need to ask anyone for anything. I want you to understand that clearly. I was not a burden. I was not fragile. I was a woman who had built something solid and was living quietly inside it. My daughter Renee came to me in the spring of that year with her husband Marcus. They had been married for 9 years. I had watched him walk her down the aisle in the backyard of this very house, under the oak tree Gerald planted when Renee was born. Marcus was charming that day. He was charming for a long time after that. They needed a place to stay, they said. Just temporarily. Marcus had left his job. He described it as a mutual decision, though Renee's eyes said something different when he used those words, and they were between apartments. They had a dog, a large one, named Brutus, who would go on to destroy the baseboards in the guest room, but that came later. What mattered then was that my daughter was standing in my kitchen looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was my child. I told them 3 months. I said it plainly, not unkindly. 3 months gives you time to get steady. I love you both, and my door is open. But this is a 3-month plan. Marcus nodded and smiled. Renee hugged me. I showed them where the extra towels were kept. 3 months became 6. 6 became a year. A year became 2. And somewhere inside that time, something shifted in the house that I could not name until it was already finished shifting. It started with small things. Marcus rearranged the pantry because, he said, it made more sense his way. I put things back. He rearranged them again. Renee asked me to please not make an issue of it. I told her it was my pantry. She looked at her phone. I started keeping my coffee on a different shelf, the high one he could not reach easily, and I told myself this was not what it felt like. He started inviting his friends over on Friday nights. Not asking. Inviting. I would come downstairs to find 4 men I barely knew sitting in my living room, the television on something loud, beer bottles on my coffee table without coasters. I began spending Friday evenings in my bedroom with the door closed and a book in my lap, telling myself it was fine. I liked quiet evenings. This was not what it felt like. My neighbor Dorothy asked me once, over the fence, while we were both checking the mail, whether everything was all right. She said I seemed different. I said I was fine and changed the subject. I was not fine. But I did not have the language yet for what was happening, because what was happening was gradual, the way water gets into old wood, not a flood, just a slow and patient pressure until the thing that was solid begins to give. I want to stop here and tell you something honestly. Something I had to sit with for a long time after all of this was over. I allowed it. Not the ending, I did not allow the ending, but the 2 years of erosion before it, I allowed that. Because Renee was my daughter, and I did not want her to feel caught between her husband and her mother. Because I remembered what it felt like to be young and struggling, and I did not want to add to her weight. Because somewhere underneath my silence, I believed that love would eventually regulate things, that if I kept being warm and present and patient, Marcus would find his footing and the pressure would ease on its own. That is the thing no one tells you about boundaries. They are not walls you put up against strangers. They are lines you have to draw even with the people you love most, even when drawing them feels like rejection, even when you are afraid of what the drawing will cost you. I did not draw them soon enough. By the time I understood that, the cost had already come due. It was a Wednesday evening in November, 2 years and 7 months after they moved in. I know the exact date, because I had circled it on my paper calendar, the kind that hangs on the wall by the refrigerator, because my friend Claudette was coming to visit that weekend from Charleston, and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. A small happiness, circled in red ink. I was in the living room in my reading chair by the front window. It is a wide chair, upholstered in blue-green fabric that has faded some, and the left armrest has a worn patch where my elbow always rests. Gerald gave me that chair as an anniversary gift 22 years ago. I was reading. The television was off. The house was quiet in the way I loved it to be quiet, which is to say, still but not empty, settled but not held. Marcus came downstairs. He was wearing the gray sweatpants he wore most days now. He had not found new employment. He had not, as far as I could observe, been looking. He crossed the living room without speaking to me and picked up the television remote from the side table. I looked up from my book. He turned on the television. Loud. A sports channel, the kind with commentators who seem to believe that volume is the same thing as information. I said pleasantly that I was reading and had the room first, and asked if he could take the TV upstairs. He looked at me. Not at my eyes, exactly. At some point slightly above my eyes, the way people look at something they have decided is not quite worth their full attention. He said, "This is my living room, too." I told him I understood that, and that we could certainly share the space, but I had been here first, and the noise was a disturbance. He said that I could go read in my room. I want you to hold the specific quality of those words for a moment. My room. As if what had been designated for my use inside my own house had become the extent of my domain. My room. A place to be sent to. I set my book down. I kept my voice even. I told him that I would be staying where I was, that this was my home, and asked him to please lower the volume. He turned the volume up. Renee appeared at the top of the stairs. She had heard the exchange, I could tell by her face. That careful expression she wore when she was calculating which direction the trouble was going. She came halfway down and stopped. I looked at her. She looked at the floor. That is the moment I remember most clearly. Not what Marcus did, what Renee did not do. She was halfway down the stairs, and she looked at the floor, and I understood in that moment that she had made her choice about who to protect. And it was not me, Marcus said, with a finality that was supposed to end the conversation. That this was his house now, and I needed to adjust to that. His house. I stood up. I picked up my book. I picked up my coffee cup. I walked to the kitchen, set both things down, and went to the hook by the back door where my car keys and my house keys hung. I took the house keys off the ring. I held them in my hand for a moment, feeling their weight, which was not very much but felt like a great deal just then. Then I put them in my cardigan pocket. I went back to the kitchen, picked up my coffee, and finished it standing at the counter. Then I picked up my purse, walked to the front door, said good night to no one in particular, and left. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not explain myself. I simply left, which is a form of speech that requires no translation. I drove to the Marriott on Bay Street, the one that looks out over the river. I have always found water calming. I got a room with a river view, and I sat in the chair by the window for a long time watching the lights on the water and not thinking about very much. When the not thinking got tired, I called my friend Claudette in Charleston. It was late, but she answered. Because we have been friends since 1989, and she answers. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she gets quiet when she is measuring what she wants to say against what needs to be said. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to handle it." She said, Do you need me to come now instead of Friday? I said no. I need one night to be still. Then I'm going to handle it. She said, okay. I love you. Call me in the morning. I slept better than I expected to. There is something clarifying about a decision, even before you know all the steps of it. The fog of 2.5 years of small accommodations and careful silences lifted somewhere in the night, and what was left underneath it was something much cleaner. Anger, yes, but organized anger. Anger with a direction. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Walter, and he has handled my legal affairs since Gerald passed and the estate needed sorting. I explained the situation concisely. I told him that I owned my home free and clear, that my daughter and her husband had been residing there for 2.5 years without any formal agreement, without financial contribution, and that the husband had told me to my face that it was his house now, and I should adjust to that. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How soon do you want them out?" I said, "How soon can it be done properly?" He explained the process. Georgia requires written notice. The relationship is what matters legally. They were not tenants, they were occupants, which actually simplified certain things. He would prepare a formal notice of termination of occupancy. It would be served by a process server, not mailed, not slid under the door, served in person with documentation. It would give them 30 days. I told him to proceed. He asked if I wanted to be present when it was served. I thought about that, about Renee's face on the stairs, about Claudette asking what I was going to do, about the worn patch on the armrest of my reading chair, all those hours of sitting in my own house feeling like a guest in it. I told Walter no. I did not need to be there. The paper would say everything that needed saying, and it would say it without any expression on my face for Marcus to interpret as doubt. What I did instead was go back to my house while they were both out. I knew Marcus went to his brother's on Thursday afternoons, and Renee had a part-time shift at the dental office where she worked, and I let myself in with the key I had taken from the hook because it was my key to my house, and I collected certain things. Gerald's watch, which lived in a box on the dresser in my bedroom. The deed to the house, which lived in a fireproof box in my closet. My mother's good china, the set she brought from Alabama when she married, which lived in the cabinet in the dining room. The photo albums from the top shelf of the hall closet. I put these things in my car. I drove back to the Marriott. I ordered room service, which I had not done in years. And I ate a very good meal, and watched the river, and called my sister in Memphis, who had been telling me for 11 months that I needed to address the situation, and I told her. She had been right. She did not say, "I told you so." That is why she is my sister. The next morning was a Friday. I was having breakfast in the hotel restaurant when my phone began to ring. It was Renee. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. I let that go, too. A text came through that said, "Mom, where are you? We're worried." Then another that said, "Mom, please answer." Then one from a number I recognized as Marcus, which said simply, "Call your daughter." I finished my breakfast. I left a generous tip because the young man who served me had been very kind and called me ma'am with what felt like genuine respect. Then I called Renee back. She answered immediately. Her voice was tight and high in the way it got when she was frightened. She said, "Mom, there's a man here. He came to the door in a suit, and he's saying he's a process server, and he has papers, and Marcus is—" I said, "I know." Silence. "You know?" "Yes, sweetheart. I know." More silence. Then, very quietly, Mom, I told her I loved her. I told her I had always loved her and I would continue to love her, and that none of what was happening changed that. But I also told her that what Marcus said to me in my own living room was not something I was willing to absorb and continue on as though it had not been said. I told her that I had been absorbing things for 2.5 years because I loved her, and that I had reached the end of what love could reasonably be asked to absorb without becoming something other than love. She started to cry. I waited. She said Marcus hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I asked her what way he had meant it then. When he said this was his house now, I asked her genuinely, not with cruelty, because I wanted to know if there was an interpretation I had missed. She didn't answer. I told her that 30 days was enough time to find a good apartment, that I would help with the security deposit if they needed it, because she was my daughter, and I was not doing this to hurt her. I was doing this because I had no other honest choice. I told her Claudette was coming the next day, and I was going to go have a good weekend with my friend. And when they were ready to talk calmly, I was available. She said, "Where are you staying?" I told her I was at the Marriott on Bay Street, in a room with a river view, and that it was very comfortable. She made a sound that might have been a laugh under other circumstances. We stayed on the phone for another few minutes without saying much. Sometimes that is what being a mother is, staying on the line. Claudette arrived Saturday morning with a bottle of good wine and the kind of blessedly ordinary conversation that has nothing to do with conflict or paperwork or the specific grief of being failed by someone you raised. We walked along the riverfront. We ate oysters. We talked about her grandchildren and my sister's new dog and a book we had both read. I did not think about my house for long stretches of time, which was a mercy. I returned home on the 28th day. Marcus and Renee were gone. They had left the place clean, which surprised me, and which I chose to receive as a small dignity offered in lieu of an apology, which was the most I was going to get from Marcus, I suspected, and I was at peace with that. They had left the furniture that was mine and taken only what was theirs. The baseboards in the guest room where Brutus had worked on them looked terrible, and I added that to a mental list of things to have repaired. The pantry had been put back the way Marcus liked it. I spent a pleasant half hour returning it to the way I liked it, which was the original way, which was my way, and found the exercise oddly satisfying. I made coffee. 2 sugars, a little cream. I sat at my kitchen table and read the newspaper. The light came through at a low angle the way it does in late morning and turned everything golden. Gerald's watch was back in its box on the dresser. My mother's china was back in the cabinet. The deed was back in its fireproof box in my closet. I sat in my reading chair by the front window that evening. My elbow found the worn patch on the armrest without my having to look. I opened my book. Outside, the light was going the way it does in November, slowly and then all at once, and the street was quiet, and the house was quiet, and the quiet was mine in a way it had not been for a long time. Renee called me 3 weeks later. Not about logistics, not about the deposit or the paperwork, just a call. We talked for an hour. We did not talk about Marcus or the living room or the stairs. We talked about Thanksgiving, whether I wanted to do it, whether she wanted to try. I said I was open to it if she was. She said she would think about it. She called again the week after that. And the week after that. I will not tell you things between us are entirely repaired. I will not tell you that what I saw on those stairs, her looking at the floor, her choosing, has stopped mattering to me. It matters. I expect it will matter for some time. But she is my daughter. We are learning, slowly, how to be honest with each other about what happened. And honest is not comfortable, but it is more durable than pretending. What I want to say to you, if you are listening to this and you recognize any part of it, is this. You do not have to make a scene. You do not have to raise your voice. You do not have to perform your anger for anyone's validation. You can simply get up, take your keys, leave quietly, and then let the appropriate mechanisms do the speaking for you, because the world has mechanisms for exactly this, for property and personhood and the rights that belong to you simply because they are yours. I kept thinking love would fix it. And love didn't fix it. What fixed it was me deciding, at 64 years old, sitting in my own chair in my own living room, that I had taught 3rd grade for 26 years, and I was not going to be sent to my room. That decision fixed it. I was home. I had always been home. I had simply needed to remember that no one, not a son-in-law, not a sweatpants and coasters and rearranged pantry, no one had ever had the authority to change that. Only I could give that away. And on the 28th day, when I walked back through my own front door with my key and found the place quiet and orderly and finally mine again, I understood something I wish someone had told me much earlier. The boundary is not the end of the relationship. Sometimes the boundary is the only thing that gives the relationship a chance of surviving. You are allowed to draw it. You are allowed to enforce it. You are allowed to choose peace. That is not cruelty. That is wisdom. And it took me 64 years and one very uncomfortable November to learn it fully. But I learned it in my own house, in my own chair, with my coffee exactly the way I like it. And that is enough.